Hello students, today's notes are going to be on section 9.5, which are on solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. Now first off, what is the quadratic formula? The quadratic formula, written right here, is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. I want you to take a second and make sure that you have that full formula in your notebook. How you say that in words? X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now there will be a video shared in tomorrow's lesson that actually sings this for you. Hopefully it'll be stuck in your head for a couple of days, but very helpful to memorize it. Alright, so the quadratic formula is for finding solutions of a quadratic equation even if it cannot be factored. So advantages of this method, you don't have to factor it. It works even when it can't be factored. That plus or minus symbol means that it does both. So if both solutions are square roots of positive numbers, you will get two solutions. Note that there can be 1, 2, or even no solutions. So where do A, B, and C come from? Well, A, B, and C are the coefficients and the constant. So this is assuming that an equation is written in standard form and set equal to 0. Reminder, what does standard form look like? That's going to be our ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Alright, so when it's in standard form, a and b are the coefficients and c is the constant. Alright, so let's give it a try. Notice where it says try it in the bottom right corner. I'm going to zoom in there. Alright, so solve 4x squared minus x equals 3 using the quadratic formula. Our first step is to set it equal to 0. So I'm starting with 4x squared minus x equals 3. I want to make sure that that says equals 0. To make the right side 0, I have to subtract 3 from both sides. So I'm going to change that equation to 4x squared minus x minus 3 equals 0. And since we're just learning what the quadratic equation is, let's identify what a, b, and c are. A is the number in front of x squared, the leading coefficient, which is 4. B is the coefficient in the middle, which is negative 1. And c is negative 3. We're going to treat subtraction signs just like a negative. Alright, so now we are going to substitute and simplify by plugging it into the formula. So our formula again is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So now let's plug in those numbers. X equals, b is already negative, so when I plug in negative 1 for negative b, now it's positive 1, plus or minus the square root. Negative 1 squared is 1, minus 4 times negative 3, all over 2 times 4. I'm going to move over here to simplify that. Alright, so I'm going to set up two equations now. I have one plus or minus. So my first equation is x equals 1 plus. I'll simplify that square root 1 minus 4 times negative 3. This is going to simplify to the square root of 49, which is also 7. Let's actually do one more step. 2 times 4 is 8 on bottom. So now our two equations, we have x equals 1 plus 7 over 8. And then we have x equals 1 minus 7 over 8. So our first equation, 1 plus 7 is 8 divided by 8. Well, x would be 1. And the second one, 1 minus 7, is negative 6 over 8, which is going to be negative 3/4. Alright, so my two solutions are x equals 1 and x equals negative 3/4. Alright, solving quadratic equations with the quadratic formula. So a friendly little reminder at the top left to remember to set the equation equal to 0 first. So let's get started on this first equation. X squared plus 1 equals 2x. Let's start by setting it equal to 0. X squared, I need to move that 2x over by subtracting 2x from both sides. So it's going to be x squared minus 2x plus 1 equals 0. A is 1, B is negative 2, and C is 1. So now when I have x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, we're going to plug in our numbers. We got x equals negative b, well b is already negative, so that becomes positive 2, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And we're going to simplify that square root in this step. So we have the square root of 0. So now this is two equations. I have 2 plus the square root of 0 over 2. And I also have 2 minus the square root of 0 over 2. But we know that the square root of 0 is 0. So both of these cases, I'm going to get x equals 2 over 2 or x equals 1. So because what's inside the square root equals 0, there is only one solution. And the solutions of the quadratic equation are also the x-intercepts of the graph, or the roots. So if we were to graph that equation that we did first on the left, x squared minus 2x plus 1 equals 0, we would find that it intersects the x-axis only at x equals 0. There's only one root, one intercept. Alright, so solve and interpret the solution for 3x squared minus 2x equals 8. Let's do the quadratic formula. First step, we need to set it equal to 0, so we're going to subtract 8 from both sides, which means our new equation will be 3x squared minus 2x minus 8 equals 0. A is 3, B is negative 2, and C is negative 8. Now we do our quadratic formula, substitute it in, so x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. We're going to simplify that square root in this step. So now we have the square root of 4 plus 96, which is also 100, over 2 times 3 is 6. So now we have two equations. We have x equals 2 plus square root of 100 is 10 over 6, and we have x equals 2 minus the square root of 100 over 6. So 2 plus 10 is going to be 12 over 6, which equals 2. And then 2 minus 10 is going to be negative 8. And over 6 equals negative 1.3 repeating. So we have two solutions here. We have both x equals 2 and x equals negative 1/3. And if we look at, negative 1 1/3. If we look at the graph, we can tell that this matches up because here is our x equals 2. And here is our x equals negative 1 1/3. So again, those solutions, the quadratic formula, they are also your intercepts. They are also the roots. If we factored this the other way that we know how to find roots, we would also get x equals 2 and x equals negative 1/3. So we now have 3 different ways to solve quadratic equations. We can graph, we can factor, or we can use the quadratic formula. Alright, let's walk through another example of the quadratic formula. So we have 2x squared plus 4x plus 8 equals 0. A is 2, B is 4, and C is 8. Remember using our quadratic formula, which is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So we're going to plug in our numbers. X equals negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 4 squared minus 4 times 2 times 8 all over 2 times 2. And we're going to simplify what's under that square root. We have negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 16 minus 4 times 2 is 8 times 8 is 64 all over 2 times 2 is 4. And there's actually going to be a negative under the square root, which means because there's a negative under that square root, we're going to have no real solutions. Again, that's because there's a negative under the square root. It's not going to be a real number, so there's no real solutions. The next core concept focuses on the discriminant. So thinking of that last example, if we had known that it was a negative under the square root, we could skip the quadratic formula altogether because we know that there are no real solutions. If we're thinking of how those graphs look, if the discriminant, so this is the number under the square root, if that's greater than 0, it crosses the x-axis twice. There are two real solutions. So if that's positive, if it's square root of a positive, there's two real solutions. If it's 0 under the square root, there is one real solution, and the x-intercept is at y equals 0. And if the discriminant is negative, if it's less than 0, that means there's no real solutions. It's not going to cross the x-axis. And the discriminant is again that b squared minus 4ac, the part that's under the square root of the quadratic formula. That's what the discriminant is. Alright, so in this example, we are going to determine the number of solutions by using the discriminant. So the discriminant is just b squared minus 4ac. So we're going to plug in our numbers. B is 8, A is 1, and C is negative 3. 8 squared is 64. 4 times negative 3 is negative 12, so 64 minus negative 12 is plus, which is going to be 76. 76 is greater than 0. This is a positive number, so we're going to have two real solutions. Part B. Well, first let's write this in standard form. 9x squared minus 6x plus 1 equals 0. Then we can write our discriminant. Reminder, the discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. So we have negative 6 squared minus 4 times 9 times 1, which is 36 minus 36, or 0. So there is going to be one real solution. That solution will be at y equals 0. It will be on the x-axis. In this example, when it says find the number of x-intercepts for the graph, it is also asking us to use the discriminant. So discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. So our b term is 3. I have 3 squared minus 4 times 2 times 9, which is 9, minus 4 times 2 is 8 times 9 is 72, or negative 63. So because this is a negative, negative 63, there will be no x-intercepts. It will not cross the x-axis. And in this one, b squared minus 4ac, we have 1 squared minus 4 times negative 1 times negative 6, which is 1 minus 24, or negative 23. So there will again be no x-intercepts. Now hopefully the minimum that you got today is what is the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And hopefully you understood how to use the formula to solve quadratic equations. And the discriminant is this part here. We can use the discriminant to determine how many x-intercepts or zeros there's going to be and how many solutions there will be for a quadratic equation.